You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome. Our opening prayer is from the Gospel of Mark. Having brought a linen cloth, he took him down, wrapped him in the linen cloth, and laid him in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance to the tomb. Welcome to this talk about the Shroud of Turin. It's mentioned in that gospel reading from Mark. It's mentioned in all the gospels. And we're going to take a look at some things about it rather than use the screen, which is sometimes hard to see if you're at a distance, and that I just took and copied off some pictures there that are in that handout. For those who might be listening to this on the internet in the future, you don't have the benefit of those handouts of those pictures, but there are so many pictures of the shroud on the internet, and if you're listening to this on the internet, you've got internet access, so you can easily do a search and find some of the pictures, so you're not going to be at a disadvantage. But for the rest of those of us who are here together today listening to this, you'll be able to take a look at those pictures and then keep them as a memento, and the little holy card as well, which has a prayer on it, so that just be a remembrance of this. So the Shroud of Turin. You can talk about its possibilities and its problems, or you can talk about its problems and its possibilities. Depends what perspective you want to take. It is a very controversial issue or artifact within the church. There are strong emotions for and against, pro and con, maybe perhaps a better way to put it, about the shroud. Now, if you remember back in your high school days or college days or that, if you knew anything or took a course about journalism, a journalist always has a certain amount of questions. Who, what, when, why, how, whatever. A good journalist is supposed to ask all those kinds of questions. The problem is with the Shroud of Turin, we can't answer any of those questions. Not a one can we answer with any certainty. And probably will never be able to answer those questions this side of the parousia. But we can say some things about it, and it can certainly be an object of meditation for us, especially in a time like this of Lent. But we don't have any definitive answers. We could say what it is, but what it could be, or what it might be, we can't nail down. It's a matter of conjecture. What it is, basically, as you see there in the first picture that's there, it's a rectangular cloth. It's huge. It's 14 and a half feet long by 3.5 feet wide. Or if you are of a biblical bent, it's 8 cubits by 2 cubits. It is a linen cloth of a type that is found in the Middle East, but not in Europe. You don't find examples of that kind of cloth in Europe. It is of a herringbone twill and of an Egyptian cloth. It is a 1st century Syrian design. Interestingly, pollen from flowers in the Middle East have been found on it. It has on it the image of a man. It has actually this image front and back meeting at the head. It goes in opposite directions. So the way that you can think of it, again, it's this long piece, 14 and a half feet long by 3.5 feet wide. You would lay it down, put a body on it, and then wrap it up around to the top of the body, with it wrapping around the head. So you'd have, let's say, for instance, take this table. If the shroud were laid on this table, a body would be put on it, and then it would be wrapped over across the top, okay, so that it reaches actually at the head for that. You can see that those pictures are not that easy to see because the shroud itself is not that easy to see, and I'll get into that a little further in the talk. A body has been placed on it. And this body shows a person, a man, who seems to have been crucified. There is blood all over the face. There is a crown, a cap kind of thorns over the head. There are scourge marks, especially on the back and on the sides. The nose and the cheek show bruises. Physically, this person depicted on the shroud is 6 feet tall. A muscular person weighing about 160 pounds. The blood is type AB. This person has shoulder-length hair. The hair is parted in the middle. And in the front are 2 very long locks of hair, much longer than the rest of the hair. Now, this image that's on here consists of 2 elements, and these are very, very important. First, there's blood, clotted blood, type AB, that's there on this cloth. And then there is an outline, for want of a better way to describe it, we'll call it a tracing. It's a tracing. We don't know how it came about. That's one of the mysteries about the shroud, as to how this came about. So you've got an outline, an image that's a sepia color, a brownish color, and you've got clotted blood. That's what makes this image. Now, what it could be. It is claimed by many to be the actual burial sheet of Jesus Christ after his death. And so, if that be true, it is a representation, an actual representation of Jesus Christ. What he looked like, his size, his characteristics and such. If, and that's an awfully big if that's what it actually is. But that's where the problem lies. If it is actually Jesus, it gives us much information about his passion and death. And what we have here is an interconnection of science and religion, our faith and our knowledge. And sometimes it's very difficult to reconcile these two. So, we can say, looking at it objectively, it's a burial cloth. But once we say something, it sometimes raises another question. And so it does for the shroud. It's a burial cloth. Okay, we'll give that. But of whom? Is it really of Jesus? Or is it of someone else? When was it made? How was it made? Many have said it's not the burial cloth of Jesus. It's a reproduction made much, much later by an artist to make it look like it was the burial cloth of Jesus. Not with any idea of a deception, of a fraud, or anything like that, but as an object for devotion. It's a relic. We can say it's a relic. But there are relics and there are relics. Some relics are actual, true, genuine relics connected with the person. Others are reproductions or some kind of representation. You can see, you can purchase in some stores and such, religious goods stores, a reproduction, a replica of the nails of the cross, the nails of Christ. And we know those aren't the real nails. We don't really know even what the real nails look like. But they are objects of devotion to help our thought, our meditation, and our prayer. Is that what the shroud is? Is it something to help our meditation, our thought, our prayer? Or is it actually the burial cloth? That's a possibility. So is it authentic? There are claims and there are counterclaims, and it goes on and on and on, and will probably for all time. Because there are historical problems, and I don't want to get into a lot of detail, but I want to give you some idea about it, because every once in a while it does come up in the media. It did not too long ago. A lot of questions are raised, a lot of misunderstandings, and maybe to clarify that, but also to, especially since we're in Lent, to say something for your own meditation, to think about it. Its origin. There are questions right from the beginning about its authenticity and its origin. Does it date to the time of Christ? And more, is it actually Christ's burial cloth? Or could it be someone else who was crucified at the time? And there were a lot of people who were crucified by the Romans at that time. How was it made? What is its history? Who has had it in their possession? And we've got a problem because we don't have the history all the way back. There are some oblique references to the shroud before the 1300s, but there is no clear documentation. There are no clear copies of images that can be traced back to the shroud. There is no direct evidence about the shroud before about the year 1350. And that's over a millennium. Where it has been, where it came from, or that. We just don't know. We know it was in the hands of various royal families, especially the House of Savoy in Turin, Italy, and hence the name, the Shroud of Turin. For that. It comes to Turin, though, in the year 1473, almost 1,500 years. And we don't know for 1,350 years where it was. It was in an area of France before it came to Turin. Is it actually made from a corpse? From a dead body that was crucified? As bizarre as that might seem, and as grotesque as it may seem, was it made that way? Or was it done by a very, very talented artist or group of artists? We don't know for sure. We do know some things, though. And if it was actually made from a crucified person, was that person that's depicted there in the shroud actually Christ in his human body? One question comes up right away. If it really is the body of Christ, why didn't the church preserve it and venerate it? Wouldn't they have? Well, maybe not. Because we are a resurrection people and we stress more Easter. And remember the early church, the apostles and the first Christians, they thought Christ was coming back very soon. It was going to happen in their lifetime. Paul, for instance, he had to change his thinking a little bit about that. When he wrote to the Thessalonians, he had to remind them that we don't know when Christ is coming back. Because they were ready to quit their jobs and thought, well, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week. The Thessalonians were saying, we're ready. Why go to work? He's going to come back next week. And Paul is saying, wait a minute. We're not sure. We hope he does soon. And of course, we're proof that he hasn't yet. But at that time, they thought it could be very soon. And so they saw no reason really to keep something like that. And also, too, the Gospels don't go into a lot of detail about the Passion itself, because the details of crucifixion would be well known by the members of the early church. Think of Peter. Think of Andrew. Think of others of the early church and other martyrs that were crucified. They knew well enough what was involved. And there are no other relics of Jesus either. Nothing else was kept. So the fact that even if this were authentically the burial cloth of Jesus, that the early church wouldn't keep it or venerate it is not totally surprising. To us it may be, and certainly we wish they would have or something, and we'd know for sure, but it's not that way. So, again, now, it would have seemed to be venerated, but it wasn't. And let me say right off the bat, I'm not going to say anything about Veronica's veil. This has no connection. The Shroud of Turin has no connection to Veronica's veil. And that's a totally separate thing, and I'm not going to deal with it here in the time that we have, or that. So just whatever you think or know or have read about that or anything, or what your own devotion to it might be or something, we're just going to sort of bracket that, okay? I'm not saying that, anything against it or that. It's just, it's not related to the Shroud of Turin. Okay, the face is not the same. If you've seen the veil of Veronica, and you see this holy card and the pictures in the handout of the face on the shroud, you see they are totally, totally different than that. So we're going to leave that go for there. So is it an actual true artifact, or is it a painting, something reproduced? Those are the main questions. Or is it genuine? Now, what does the church say? What's the church's position on this? The Gospels and the shroud will agree in giving no real explanation to how it came to be or its early history. There's nothing like in the Acts of the Apostles or anything, or any of the other New Testament writings. Paul doesn't speak about it, none of the apostles do or anything. And that the Gospels only have those quotes that are at the beginning of your handout, the one from each Gospel, and the one I use as our opening prayer for it. But both the Gospels and the shroud accurately reflect crucifixion as we know the Romans practiced it. The nail holes, the wound in the side, the scourging, the crown of thorns. Evidence can be seen of all of this there. The long locks of hair in front are interesting. They were a sign of rebellion, actually, amongst Jewish people, Jewish men, a rebellion against foreign domination. And they were also a symbol in Jewish tradition of the Nazirite vow. Now, there's a play on words there that the evangelists who speak about that are using when they talk about Jesus being a Nazarene. Yes, he was. He was from Nazareth. He grew up there. But he was also a Nazarene in that it seems that he had that tradition of a certain dedication to God his Father. And we know this from other figures in the Bible. Now, when you think of long hair, you think of Samson. All right, well, the hair was important for him. It was a symbol of his strength. But also, too, John the Baptist. Paul talks about shaving his hair in fulfillment of a vow. It was something that was done as part of Jewish tradition in some circles, done at the time of our Lord. So it's well within the realm of possibility. And so it has a Jewish background. And so a symbol for that. You see it on the shroud. I don't know if it came out so well. Again, in your handouts or that, we're working with, copies of things and such. It's two things. If we would have much larger copies, you could see it better. And also, too, they say that if you stand further back from a full-size copy, things are a little bit clearer, which, of course, we can't do here for this. And it's a little hard, because if you zoom in on it, it doesn't really help as much. Believe me, I've tried it with the computer and such for that. So, but you can see the longer locks, even though the hair itself is long all the way through, much longer in the front for this. And it seems to go with this idea of being a Nazarite, both figuratively and literally as well, which is an interesting thing. So what we have here, from the church's perspective, is we have a historical artifact, like a document, and we also have a relic at the same time. Those are two different perspectives. Let me give you an example of this idea that there are relics and there are relics. Some relics are very closely associated with some particular saint. The church has different classes of relics, and I don't have time to go through all of that, and it has modified the classifications over the ages and such. And other things that are close to it. For instance, let's use an example from our own time. St. John Paul II. There are relics, very few, very restricted, of the cassock he was wearing when he was shot, has the blood stains in it and such. That's a relic. It's also a historical artifact. Okay. Now, there are also other relics of John Paul II, pieces, little small snippets of other cassocks that he wore throughout his life. Those are relics as well. Not the one with the importance that it had when the assassination attempt took place. Then there are also other kinds of relics. I personally have a relic of John Paul II. What it is a small, small piece of cloth that was never worn by John Paul II. What they did was they took a cloth that was similar to the cassock material and rubbed it against an actual cassock that he wore. It's a relic, certainly not of the class of the other two, but it's a relic. The relics, for instance, like, again, the nails of the cross that are reproductions made in our contemporary time of that. It's a kind of relic. All right, so you've got to keep your mind open a little bit with this back and forth for us. And so we've got the mention of the shroud in Scripture. Each gospel's got a mention of burial cloths, at least one, if not an extra one around the head or something, and you've got them listed right there for that. So we know that there was something there. John Paul II himself spoke about the shroud as a relic. In the early centuries, some popes affirmed it and others denied it. And they didn't have the scientific equipment to investigate or the kinds of historical help and everything for it. So some popes said yes, some said no. So I'm only going to go with those in our own contemporary time for it. We'll start with Pius XII. In the 1940s, Pius XII started a devotion to the Holy Face. And there is a parish in the Archdiocese of Washington that's called Holy Face Parish. And the devotion started by Pius XII, its feast day is Mardi Gras. It's the idea of the Tuesday before Ash Wednesday for it. And they made images from the face on the shroud for this devotion for it. In 1955, a miracle was attributed to the shroud. A 10-year-old girl was cured of paralysis. In 1973, November 23rd, the shroud was first seen on television, and the introduction to that demonstration was by Paul VI for it. The actual shroud was owned by the House of Savoy in Turin. Remember, I said it came in 1473. And it was owned by the Royal House of Savoy in Turin up until 1983. And they gave it to the Pope. And so now, really, the shroud is owned by the Pope. And its custodian is whomever might be the Archbishop of Turin. It's still kept in Turin. So it's owned by the Pope, but the curator of it is the Archbishop, or the Cardinal Archbishop usually, of Turin. And it resides in the cathedral at Turin, the Cathedral of John the Baptist. It's behind the altar in a side chapel that was built specifically for it. That's right next to the high altar in the Cathedral of Turin, and it's totally secure. It used to be wrapped in red silk and put into a silver case. Now it's in a glass case that's fit to the whole huge size of that. It's airtight, and it's also bulletproof. There have been attacks on it. In 1978, about 3.5 million people saw it on display. There are replicas of it, full-size ones. There's a church in Rome that has a full-size replica of the shroud, the whole 14.5 feet by 3.5 feet for it that's there. But these are representations. These are not genuine. There are many of those. It is of object of interest to those who are not Catholic. There are certain Baptist groups who have a tremendous respect for the Shroud of Turin, interestingly enough. John Paul II spoke of it as an enigma of an image that is a challenge for our intelligence. That was what John Paul II said about it. Benedict XVI called it an icon of blood, and a scourged man crucified with thorns, crucified and pierced on the right side. And in 2019, Pope Francis spoke of it and said it is an icon of a man scourged and crucified. And Pope Francis also said that we should contemplate it, but none of the popes gave a statement of authenticity, either for or against. None of the recent popes have ever come out and said yes or no in that way. There is a problem of keeping it from deteriorating, as it is so many hundreds of years. And also, too, the Church has, if any statement said about it, or that the Church, being the owner of it and having the care of it, has made the statement that has decreed that any future work or examination done by the shroud will only be for preserving it, not for investigating or examining its historicity or its authenticity. Only for preservation, not for investigation. It is not claimed to be Christ. It has no doctrinal significance in the Church. That's left up to the individual. If you want to believe in it and believe it is actually the burial cloth of Christ, you may do that. If you don't want to believe it, you may do that as well. It is the relation of faith and science. It is the interchange of our faith and our devotion, along with scientific fact and historical reality and such. The shroud itself does not contribute to our doctrine. It may very greatly contribute to our devotion and our prayer and our contemplation, but it is not part of our doctrine. It has no relation to the catechism in a sense that it can prove or disprove anything at all for it. Obviously, Jesus died, suffered, died, and rose, and we may learn an awful lot about his passion, death, and resurrection from the shroud, but there is nothing doctrinal that's taught. So notice the difference of that too as well. It was damaged twice in fires and had to be repaired. And that's why when you look at those pictures, you see triangles sort of like in the middle of them, running down the length of them. And that those are the patches. They used to keep the shroud folded up. It was folded 8 times and folded in a way so that the face was showing. And then it was wrapped in silk and it was put in a silver case. For a long time, it was like that. Now, there was a fire. There's a fire in 1532, December 4th of 1532. And the fire melted the silver case, parts of it, that contained the shroud. And so think of like a small case, like a valise or something like that, excuse me, that it was kept in, and the molten silver burned through it, burned through just the edges, not the center, thankfully. but around some of the edges. So that if you took, and let's say this was the shroud, this piece of paper, and it's folded over. I just folded it over a couple of times. All right. And the molten silver burned through the edges. So I cut out some of the edges. If you were then to open it out, you'd see the holes. That's what those triangles are. They are the patches. So that's why you see those running down through there. There was a group of, there was some scorches as well, and there were water stains when they put the fire out. All that was in 1532. A group of Poor Clare nuns tried to repair the damage from that fire, and they sewed in about 30 patches, those very large ones that you see, and other ones in other places for that. Okay. And it was because of the molten silver that burned through. In 1972, there was an arson attempt, but it was not successful. In 1997, there was a fire in the cathedral in Turin, which was suspected to be also an arson attempt, but there was no damage that was done. So there have been repairs done to it. That's why it's in a bulletproof, airtight glass case for its own safety and security. So it's had attacks on it. And not so long ago, certainly the one in 72 was arson. 97, they think, was as well, and it burned part of the cathedral. But luckily, no damage was done. Now, to move on then, it's scientific investigation, when that was still allowed by the church. There are a number of different scientific disciplines that have to be used for this. 3 of them, basically. There are, first set of disciplines are the material, chemical, and historical. So taking a look at the actual material, that it's an Egyptian kind of cloth, that it's a linen cloth, the investigation of that pollen is found on it, those kinds of things that are done, the material examination of it, the chemical examination of it, what might be found on it outside of the blood, that's a whole separate discipline, and historical information. What historical facts do we actually have that we can verify? That's the first set, the material, chemical, and historical. The second set of disciplines are the biological and the medical. The blood, an analysis of the blood that are there, the clots and such, and medical information about the trauma to the body of a crucifixion, scourging, all of that data that medicine can tell us, that doctors can tell us. And the third discipline is that of imaging, the analysis of x-rays, scanning, digital kinds of investigation that's done, especially with computers and such, where image scans are taken of the shroud and that. In May, 28th of May in 1898, the first photographs were taken of the shroud. And a very interesting and important thing was found, important for later historical considerations as well. There are 2 very, very, very important historical things. The date of 1350 and now the photographs at the late time of the 1800s. When they take pictures of the shroud, they determine that the shroud itself is a negative image. Now, nobody knew that until they took a photograph. Now we take digital photographs, we don't have the kinds of film that produces a negative. So you got to sort of keep that in mind a little bit here for this. So the shroud itself is a negative, like a photographic negative. All right? So that if you take a photo of it with film, the film is a negative of the negative of the shroud, so it's a positive. Let me go through that again. I'm not trying to confuse it, but it's important in the history for it, and I'll come back to it. So you've got the shroud. The shroud is placed against a body, and it makes an image. The image is that of a photographic negative. When you take a photograph, the photograph, when you develop it, the developed picture, is like the shroud. But the negative of the film is the negative of negative is a positive. We'll come back to that. That's important, though. Trust me. Okay. Because actually, basically, not to let it hang, if it is a fake or some kind of artifact that somebody made, how could they ever know back in the 1300s what a photographic negative was? And we know from 1350 on its history. So that's part of what's used in trying to figure out that this was not made by somebody. This is not a fake. This is genuine. Okay, for that. There have been scientific investigations. A group of Americans, for the most part, not entirely, but in 1978, a group came together, and there's about 42 experts from a number of different countries, about 8 or 9 different countries, mainly, though, based out of America. They used about $2 to $2.5 million worth of equipment to investigate the shroud. It was done in October of 1978. It was the most extensive and highly scientific testing that's ever been done on the shroud. And the results were mixed. They came up with no clear conclusions. The results of the test, though, that were clear to them was that it was not done by the hand of an artist. There is no brush stroke like it was painted. There's no paint at all. They didn't find any chemical trace of paint or of any kind of pigment or any other kind of anything like that, or of a dye, anything like that. The image, the tracing part, the sepia part, was not done by scorching or burning, interestingly enough. And they came to the conclusion that the blood stains preceded the image. Think about that for a moment. The blood stains were present on the shroud before that tracing sepia image. They were able to find that, so how it was laid on there in the examination they were doing with all of this equipment, and that the blood did soak in as well to the cloth. The image is slowly fading. That's why it's kept in an airtight case. It also now is not folded. It's kept flat, totally extended, so that it will not sag. Nothing will pull on it or that. And it's kept flat. There is also concern it's not put on display or out in the open because of light. Ultraviolet light, sunlight, light from artificial lighting of that is accelerating the fading of it for that. So there was this examination in 1978. They came up with those things. They couldn't come up with a definitive conclusion. In 1988, they decided to use carbon-14, which is used for a lot of archaeological artifacts and such. And that was, in many ways, unfortunate. They did this in 1988, and a small group did it. They were going to do it with a large group and several different independent investigators and such. They did it with just a small group. And the long and short of it was they did this carbon-14 and they said, it dates to 1350, it's a fake. The media went nuts and everything. But many, many other scientists said, wait a minute. That's very doubtful. And it was immediately debated, and actually now the carbon-14 testing in 1988 has been refuted. The sample was very, very small because when you do carbon-14, you have to destroy a certain amount of the sample. And so they took only a very, very small part, not enough, actually. There was a coating on the fibers of the shroud that were taken for that, and so it wasn't a good sample for that reason as well. And carbon-14 has a huge range of limits for finding something. It's used for things that are thousands and thousands of years old. 1,300 years is not a long time in carbon-14. 10,000 or more is more the kinds of ranges that carbon-14 is used for. So it wasn't the best to use for it. Also, too, there was no good scientific methodology used. There was no peer review. In scientific methodology, one of the things that scientists do is they have different independent groups try to do the same kind of a test and see if they can duplicate the results. Can they come up with the same conclusion? But the group that did this in 1988 never released the raw data as to how they did it. Just certain things came in news reports that they found out that the parts were contaminated and such for that. And so they couldn't duplicate it to check it. There was no way to check what was done for it. And so it's been refuted as far as any of the carbon-14. And it's unfortunate because it changed a lot of people's thinking on a thing. It caused a lot of controversy. But it's not the only time that the shroud has caused controversy. We'll see one more yet. Not too long ago, a number of years back, an idea came out that somebody came up with that there were coins placed on the eyes of the person on the shroud. And they said, if we can examine the shroud and lift off of it what those coins looked like, maybe we'll get a date, maybe we'll get the name of an emperor, and we can solve the problem of its origin that way. And that got an awful lot of time in the press and such. But actually, it's debated that any coins were used at all. We know that coins were used at the time of Christ, that they would put coins on the eyes of the corpse in order to close the eyes. I would hold the eyes closed. That was the idea. If we can get to those coins, if we can lift an image off of those coins, get a date, get a name, an emperor, something like that, and we could say, aha. But they didn't use it all the time, and the problem is that the coins actually don't show us anything. They're too small, if there's anything at all. There's not enough detail to resolve it, even with magnifying it, or even looking with a microscope. There's not enough to be seen. It doesn't seem like certainly there's any writing on it. There's no dates on it, any image or anything. People have tried to look at it, and that most scholars say it's wishful thinking. It's too neat of a solution, and that some posited that solution because that would have helped them come up with some kind of proof. It's just not there. It's just not there. Another interesting thing upon examining, and you can't really tell from the pictures, but with a close examination, if you take a close look, and this you can see with proper examination, again, I don't think those show it, one arm is longer than the other. Now there's something. And that's verifiable. That's true. How does that come about for it? So some have looked at that and said, it's a fake. They didn't do it right. Whoever was faking it didn't do it. Jesus didn't have one arm longer than another. Did he? Well, what's going on there on that? Well, a couple of things that the medical people have been able to find about that. One is that at the time after our Lord's death, that rigor mortis had started to set in. And what you've got is that you have a three-dimensional body that is placed on a two-dimensional sheet so that the points of contact are not equal. In other words, the sheet is not, in a sense, the body is laid on it, it's not packed around. Remember, they did this very quickly because it was Sabbath and Passover. And it was just laid on the shroud and it was covered over. And so the part that's covered over on the top, the hands are crossed, as you can see that very clearly in those pictures. And so it's not evenly there on that. Again, between a three-dimensional body and a two-dimensional cloth. And also, too, because rigor mortis has started to set in, the body, they figure, and also looking from both sides of the shroud, in other words, the part underneath, part of everything, and all the imaging that's done, that's again that third discipline of the scans and the computer, the topography and such, that the body was not flat. It was arched a little bit, okay, for that. So there's a problem that resolves that for that. So again, we're still back at how was the image made? Before all of the modern technology and such, the best theory was that it was done by some kind of interaction of chemicals, of sweat, uric acid, blood, ammonia, or something like that, that made the image, the tracing, and then with the clotting of the blood. That was the earlier theory. But more modern analysis has found that, as a matter of fact, there aren't any chemicals. There are no chemicals, ammonia, or anything for it. So a theory was evolved. There was some kind of light energy, that heat and light at the moment of the resurrection. This is how you get the blood and the image and that interaction back and forth that I mentioned with that. There, though, it's hard to figure out exactly what may have happened. The closest they ever came up with was a similarity to what happened when the atomic bombs were dropped. There are examples like Nagasaki, Hiroshima, where when the blast went off, let's say, just to try to say the blast is here. There were people walking along a street with a building over there, and it left the image of the person, the outline of the person who was vaporized, gone, but left an image on the wall from the blast. They think that that may have happened at the moment of the resurrection. Jesus' body was resurrected, was gone, but the image was left on the shroud. Now, there's a lot of problems with that, obviously, for that. And so it's not held by a lot of scholars for it. And the other problem is, besides any theological problems that may be with that, just how could they get, if it was a fake, if you're of the camp that says it's a fake, how are you going to get that to happen back in the Middle Ages? What kind of thing are you going to use to make an explosion or to have that kind of light for it? So the idea of some kind of radiation emission at the instant of the resurrection, it can't be duplicated. Others would say no, because that's actually what genuinely actually happened. But that has its theological problems as well. Okay? And the biggest problem is any kind of an explosion like that or emission would have done something to change the material of the shroud. And there is no evidence of anything ever changing on the shroud. And I just put as one thing because it always comes up in a question of that. What about DNA testing? They ever do DNA testing? No. They have never done it, nor will they, because remember the church has said no investigations except for preservation. And a DNA test, while it might tell us some interesting things, is not going to help in the preservation of the deteriorating shroud. And so the church will not allow it. It can't be done for investigative reasons for it. Okay. So, as it stands today, there is no known technology that can explain it. much less any technology that might be known in the 1300s. Remember, that's a key date because we know from 1350 on what happened to the shroud. There's no question we can refute anything from 1350 on. Others are saying, well, if it was an artifact that some artist made or some did it before that, and that's the time when we don't know. No, they wouldn't be able to do it. And that, especially with all the modern stuff that we've used with it. So again, there's no pigments, no paints, no dyes, no chemicals. It's not printed. It's not burned in on the cloth. The image is present even when there was no direct contact. Remember, the three-dimensional body on a two-dimensional sheet, even where there wasn't the actual physical contact, the sepia tracing is there. That's what led to the idea of the atomic theory for it. But again, we can't explain that. And remember, the image is underneath the blood stains on the shroud. And no blood was upset at all. If you would consider, for instance, at the moment of the resurrection of whatever happened, that the body came out of the shroud or something, nothing was disturbed in any of that at all. So some burst of light energy of that, there is indication that the shroud had held the body for no more than 2 days, which is interesting because, of course, it follows with the Passion, Death, and Resurrection. And from Good Friday, Holy Saturday, Easter Sunday for it. Yet there would not be any intensity of light today that could duplicate that, much less by somebody trying to fake a reproduction at that time. We can't do it at all on such a large scale at all. So that lends credence to the idea that it is genuine, but we don't know how it happened. It's miraculous. And that for it. Again, many, many questions for it. Other repairs have been done in its history. It's been on exhibit several times. It was on exhibit in 1998 and in 2000. It was scanned totally in the year 2000, on display again in 2010. Computer images were done in 2013. It was on display again in 2015. The next time it is to be on display will be in 2025. Not too far away. But all of this, and especially with the church now not allowing investigative work to be done, nothing can be proven one way or the other conclusively. One other thing that was done that was controversial that I alluded to was in the time from March to July of 2002, something different was done. It wasn't an investigative kind of work on the shroud, but they did or attempted to do a restoration. A restoration was done. Very controversial in its methods and in its results. It was prepared for and then finally carried out in June and July of this. Now, without going into all the details. What they did was they decided that they would try to clean up some of the burn marks, not from the generation of the shroud, but from the fires, especially that one in 1532, where it was charred. They thought they would scrape that clean. In doing that, of course, they're removing parts and pieces of it, even if just small filings of it. They said that they kept them all and, took them piece by piece, section by section. That's kind of hard to imagine of doing that for it. What they did actually was clean away a lot of evidence from it. They did this without using the proper methods. They didn't wear gloves. They contaminated the cloth by handling it. They used bright, huge spotlights to illuminate it, to clean it and such, which caused problems. They're trying not to do that so that they don't fade the image anymore. But they did it while they were doing this over the weeks that this work was done. It was sloppy technique. They did it out in an open room. They didn't use a clean room or a laboratory or anything like that while they did all of this. So it was a problem of contamination. And that's also the problem with doing DNA, because it's contaminated from all the people, all the centuries where it was handled by so many different people for that. When they had done the patches, when the Poor Clare nuns did the patches, which they did 1534, the fire was 1532, the patch was done 2 years later, they also put a backing on the shroud, a red silk backing. In 2002, they decided to remove that painstakingly and put a white one in. So you'll see where they have a picture in there. I put one in there, and you see those patches where they were, where the burns were and everything. They're filled in again, but they're much lighter because they're done now in white for that. So that explains that for it. It isn't the best of ways to do things, but it was done for that. So these things are happening and that. And so the creases and the wrinkles are still there from when it was folded, and we have that information. That's really all that can be said about it, which is a lot, but there are no certainties, no real certainties. That's why the church has never made a particular statement about it. It recommends it as a relic, but again, there are relics and there are relics for that. There are some probabilities, a lot of things we can say, a lot we can say about the Passion from it, and there are some possibilities as well. But we've got to leave it at that. And so it's to your meditation for this Lent, and thank you very much for listening to this.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.